You're lying in the belly of a longship, hours before dawn, and the world is nothing but darkness, cold planking under your back, and the quiet, rhythmic creak of timber flexing against black water. Somewhere nearby, a man is snoring with genuinely heroic confidence, completely unbothered by the fact that he's about to take part in a raid. You envy him. You also sort of want to nudge him with your foot, but that seems like a poor way to start a partnership with your crewmates. This is the deep pre-dawn hour, the hour sailors have always hated and loved in equal measure, when a ship crosses the last stretch of open water toward a coastline nobody aboard has ever technically visited, only heard about, whispered descriptions passed along by earlier traders, or a captured local guide who, understandably, isn't feeling especially chatty about giving directions to his own hometown's undoing. The crew numbers perhaps 30 or 40 men, packed into a vessel barely 20 meters long, and there is no privacy here, no personal space, nothing but shared cold, shared silence, and the occasional low murmur of someone checking gear by feel rather than sight. Mainstream historical fact, delivered quietly so as not to wake anyone, raiding parties of this size were common for smaller-scale coastal operations, distinct from the much larger, multi-ship invasion forces like the Great Heathen Army you may have heard about elsewhere. A single ship's crew, loosely organized under a respected captain or local chieftain, could operate independently, striking fast and pulling out before any real defense assembled. This wasn't always some grand royal campaign. Sometimes it was just an ambitious, reasonably well-armed group of neighbors who'd pooled resources for a ship and a plan, which honestly sounds a little bit like a very high-stakes version of a group vacation, minus the itinerary and plus significantly more weapons. The navigator, an older man with the kind of weathered, permanently squinting face that suggests decades spent staring at horizons, has been quietly reading the sky for the last hour, tracking a handful of stars barely visible through drifting cloud. There's no compass here, remember, just memorized star patterns, the smell and color of the water, and a genuinely impressive mental map built from a lifetime of listening to other sailors' stories. Historians still argue about exactly how precise this kind of dead reckoning navigation could be across open water, whether these voyages relied more on careful, cumulative technique or a fair amount of educated risk-taking dressed up afterward as expertise. Probably some of both, honestly, the way most impressive-looking expertise usually works. Somewhere toward the bow, a younger crew member, maybe on his first raid, judging by the way he keeps checking his weapon like it might have wandered off since the last time he looked, mutters something to the man beside him, and there's a low ripple of quiet laughter. Nerves dressed up as jokes. Some things really don't change across 1,000 years. Put any group of people in a stressful, high-stakes situation before dawn, and someone's going to crack a bad joke to relieve the tension, and someone else is going to laugh a little too hard at it out of sheer relief. You notice the gear scattered around you now that your eyes have adjusted properly, round shields stacked along the gunnels, spears bundled and lashed for the crossing, a few prized swords wrapped in oiled cloth to keep off the salt spray, because a good sword represented serious investment, sometimes generations of family wealth, and nobody was about to let seawater ruin it before it even got used. Food stores are modest, dried fish, hard bread, a skin or two of watered ale, because speed matters more than comfort on an operation like this. This isn't a leisurely voyage. This is closer to a smash and grab with excellent boat handling. Quirky tidbit, tucked in gently while the ship rocks beneath you, some raiding crews reportedly time their approaches around religious festivals or specific market days, when a target settlement would be unusually full of visitors, livestock, and portable wealth all conveniently gathered in one place. Whether this was common, deliberate strategy or a happy coincidence noted after the fact in later storytelling remains genuinely debated, but either way, imagine planning a heist around the neighborhood's busiest shopping day. There's a certain grim, practical logic to it that would make a modern retail analyst nod approvingly, assuming that analyst had significantly lower ethical standards. Nobody aboard knows exactly what today holds. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy, looking back from 1,000 years later, to treat history as though everyone involved knew their role in some grand, inevitable story. They didn't. This crew has a plan, a rough sense of the coastline they are approaching, and absolutely no guarantee that anything will go smoothly. Weather could turn. Defenders could be waiting. The whole day could collapse into chaos or disaster within the first hour. That uncertainty sits in the ship with everyone, quiet and unspoken, the way real anxiety before real risk usually behaves, not dramatic, just present, humming faintly under everything else. The navigator finally straightens, says something low to the captain near the steering oar, and a subtle shift moves through the crew, shoulders straightening, gear being quietly checked one final time. Land is close now, though you can't see it yet. You can smell it, though, faintly, carried on the wind, wood smoke, damp earth, something green and growing that's entirely different from the flat, mineral smell of open ocean you've been breathing all night. Somewhere ahead, in the dark, an entire unsuspecting community is still asleep, going about the last peaceful hours it will have for a very long time, and you're about to watch the sky above that coastline slowly, inevitably, begin to lighten. Section 2. First light. The horizon ahead is changing now, and you notice it before you consciously register why. A thin grey seam appearing where black sky meets black water, spreading slowly, reluctantly, the way dawn always seems to take its time when you're anxious for it to hurry up or, in this particular case, anxious for it to stay away just a little longer. First light on a raid morning is a genuinely strange kind of beautiful, soft pink and gold bleeding across a coastline that's about to have an extremely bad day. You can see land now, properly, for the first time. Low cliffs, a scatter of trees, smoke rising in thin, lazy columns from a settlement tucked just beyond the shoreline, someone's early morning cooking fire, completely unaware of what's approaching from the water. There's something genuinely unsettling about watching ordinary domestic life continue, undisturbed, in the last minutes before it gets violently interrupted. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, carried faintly across the water. Somebody's rooster, apparently either extremely punctual or extremely confused about the actual time, lets out a crow that echoes oddly across the quiet bay. Mainstream historical fact, and it matters here, successful raids depended enormously on this specific window, first light, when a settlement's defenses, such as they were, would typically be at their most relaxed, watchmen tired from a full night's duty, most residents still asleep or just beginning their morning routines. Coastal monasteries and undefended villages rarely maintained serious overnight security, because for most of their existence, they genuinely never needed to. That assumption, the quiet confidence that comes from generations without a serious external threat, was precisely the vulnerability raiders like this crew had learned to exploit with brutal efficiency. The captain, standing near the steering oar, is scanning the coastline with the focused, unhurried calm of someone doing this for what is clearly not the first time. He's looking for specific things: the best landing beach, any sign of movement or alarm on shore, the general layout of buildings that might indicate where wealth is concentrated. This is reconnaissance happening in real time, not some carefully mapped out battle plan drawn up weeks in advance. A good raid captain reads the coastline like you might read a room at a party, quickly assessing who's important, where the good stuff probably is, and how fast you could reasonably make an exit if things go sideways. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's a genuinely practical one. Raiders reportedly sometimes released a bird, likely a raven, in flight to help gauge the location and distance of nearby land, based on the bird's instinct to fly directly toward the nearest shore, essentially a low-tech, feathered GPS system with admittedly limited accuracy but a charming resourcefulness. Whether this specific navigational trick was widely and reliably used, or represents more of an occasionally attempted technique later exaggerated in storytelling, is, characteristically, another point where the evidence doesn't offer a clean, confident answer. The ship's pace has changed now, oars dipping with slower, more deliberate precision, everyone aboard fully awake and alert, that earlier pre-dawn tension replaced by something sharper, more focused. Someone hands you a shield without a word, and the weight of it in your hands makes everything suddenly, uncomfortably real in a way that vague nighttime anxiety hadn't quite managed. This isn't abstract anymore. This is happening, right now, in the next several minutes, to real people who are, at this exact moment, probably thinking about breakfast rather than survival. You notice the crew's expressions shifting too, not fear exactly, though there's certainly some of that mixed in for the younger, less experienced members, but something closer to concentration, the specific quiet intensity of people about to do something requiring precision and nerve. A couple of older warriors near you are quietly murmuring what sounds like some kind of prayer or invocation, presumably to Odin or Thor. Remember those two from the fireside stories, and there's a strange, genuine sincerity to it that cuts through any temptation to view this whole operation as purely mercenary or cynical. These people believed, deeply, that the outcome of the next few hours rested at least partly in divine hands, not purely their own skill. Historians still argue, incidentally, about how much genuine religious motivation factored into raids like this versus straightforward economic opportunism. Was this framed, in the minds of the people doing it, as something the gods actively sanctioned or even encouraged, or was religious ritual before combat more about calming nerves and building group cohesion than any deeply theological justification for violence? Probably, again, some uncomfortable blend of both, since humans have always been remarkably skilled at finding spiritual justification for things they were already fairly motivated to do anyway. The coastline is close now, close enough that you can make out individual buildings, a cluster of simple houses, a slightly larger structure with a cross visible even from this distance, marking it clearly as some kind of religious building, and beyond that, fields, livestock, the ordinary infrastructure of a small, undefended community that has, until this exact morning, had absolutely no reason to fear the sea. The captain gives a low, quiet signal, and the ship angles toward a stretch of open beach, oars working now with real purpose, cutting cleanly through water that's gone from black to gray to a soft, deceptively gentle morning blue. Behind you, someone checks their axe one final time. Ahead of you, the beach is close enough now that you can hear waves lapping gently against sand, utterly indifferent to what's about to happen on top of it. Section 3. The landing. The hull scrapes against sand with a sound that feels, in this tense, focused moment, almost shockingly loud, a long, grinding shudder that travels up through the wood and into your feet, and then the ship is still, beached firmly on a stretch of coastline that, until about 90 seconds ago, belonged entirely and peacefully to someone else. Men are already moving around you, that earlier stillness replaced by fast, practiced motion, shields grabbed, weapons drawn, the whole crew spilling over the sides of the vessel with the coordinated efficiency of people who have clearly rehearsed this exact sequence more times than they'd probably care to admit. Mainstream historical fact, worth remembering as your feet hit the sand. This shallow draft beaching capability, remember that clinker-built flexibility from the boatyards, wasn't just a nice technical feature, it was the entire tactical foundation of coastal raiding. Most contemporary European ships required proper harbors or at least reasonably deep, protected water to land safely. Norse longships could run directly onto open beach, disgorge a full raiding party in minutes, and just as quickly reverse the whole process for a rapid departure. No dock. No warning. No time for anyone on shore to organize meaningfully before the raiders were already ashore and moving. The captain is already directing small groups with quick, low gestures, no shouting yet, that would come soon enough, but for now, silence and speed are the priority. A handful of men peel off toward what looks like a small cluster of fishing boats pulled up further along the beach, presumably to secure or disable them, cutting off any chance of a fast waterborne warning reaching neighboring settlements. Another group moves toward higher ground, scouting the immediate approach to the village proper. You find yourself moving with the main body, shield up, heart doing something considerably faster and less composed than you'd like to admit. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's genuinely useful context. Archaeological and saga evidence suggests raiders sometimes deliberately targeted the tide, timing their landing so the falling tide would leave their ship more firmly, safely beached during the raid itself, only needing the incoming tide later to help refloat it for departure, essentially letting the ocean itself handle part of the logistics. A nice bit of free labor from a genuinely indifferent business partner. Get the tides wrong, though, and you could end up stuck on a beach considerably longer than planned, which is exactly the kind of scheduling mistake nobody wants to make while actively invading somewhere. There's a dog barking now, closer, more urgent than the earlier distant one, and you catch a flicker of movement near the village's edge, someone, probably a farmer up early for chores, catching sight of the raiding party and freezing for one long, terrible half-second before turning and sprinting toward the settlement, already shouting. So much for the element of surprise lasting the entire operation. The captain's response is immediate and entirely unbothered, a quick hand signal, and the pace shifts from stealthy approach to outright fast movement, the whole crew breaking into something between a jog and a controlled run. This is the part of a raid that popular imagination tends to compress into a single dramatic instant, but the reality involves genuine physical exertion, coordination, and no small amount of controlled chaos. Men are moving in loose formation rather than any kind of tight, disciplined military line. This isn't a Roman legion, it's more like a genuinely dangerous, well-armed group of neighbors moving with shared purpose but individual initiative, each person reading the immediate situation and adjusting rather than waiting for detailed orders. Historians still argue about how much formal tactical coordination raids like this actually involved versus how much depended on individual warriors' judgment and experience in the moment, with the evidence suggesting considerably more improvisation than the neatly organized battle formations popular media sometimes depicts. You're close enough to the village now to make real, specific details: thatched roofs, a low wooden fence around what's probably a livestock pen, smoke still rising from that same cooking fire you spotted from the water, and increasingly, actual people emerging from doorways in various states of alarm and undress, some frozen in shock, others already grabbing children and running for the tree line. There's nothing remotely glamorous about this moment, whatever certain dramatic retellings might suggest. It's frightening, fast, and genuinely chaotic, adrenaline overriding most coherent thought, your own breathing loud in your ears as you cross the final stretch of open ground between beach and settlement. The captain and his closest lieutenants are already peeling toward that larger building you spotted earlier, the one with the cross, moving with clear priority and purpose. Whatever's inside there is presumably worth reaching first, before the rest of the settlement fully wakes to what's happening. Other groups are fanning out toward the houses, and you catch, from the corner of your eye, the unmistakable, oddly mundane sight of livestock scattering in panic, chickens exploding in every direction with far more urgency than the moment probably strictly requires from a chicken's perspective, though to be fair, their perspective on the situation is arguably quite reasonable. You're inside the settlement's edge now, close enough to smell wood smoke and fresh bread, someone's actual breakfast still sitting untouched and forgotten on a table you glimpse through an open doorway, and there's something genuinely jarring about that detail. The collision between this raid's violent purpose and the small, mundane, entirely human domestic scene it's crashing directly into. Somewhere ahead, you hear the first raised voice, sharp and commanding, and you realize, with a fresh spike of adrenaline. Section 4. The approach: you're moving through the settlement's outer edge now, and the sound around you has shifted dramatically from that earlier, tense quiet into something considerably louder and more chaotic, shouting in a language that isn't yours, a child crying somewhere close, the sharp, splintering crack of a door being forced open. This is the part of the raid where whatever plan existed largely dissolves into a series of fast, individual decisions, and it's genuinely disorienting, even for you, an observer several steps removed from actual danger. The main raiding party has split into smaller groups now, each targeting specific structures, houses, storage buildings, that larger church structure toward the settlement center. This isn't random chaos, though it might look that way at first glance. There's a rough logic underneath it, prioritizing buildings most likely to contain portable wealth, precious metal, textiles, tools, food stores, while avoiding wasted time on structures unlikely to yield much. Mainstream historical fact worth holding onto here: raids like this operated on genuinely tight time pressure, typically lasting hours rather than days, because the longer a raiding party lingered, the greater the risk of local defenders organizing an effective counterattack, or reinforcements arriving from neighboring settlements alerted by fleeing witnesses. You watch one group efficiently working through a modest farmhouse, emerging within minutes carrying blankets, a few pieces of simple jewelry, a small cache of what's probably preserved food. There's nothing especially dramatic about this specific moment, honestly. It looks almost bureaucratic in its efficiency, methodical rather than frenzied, which is somehow more unsettling than pure chaos would be. These aren't people losing control in some violent frenzy. They're professionals, in a grim sense, executing a task they've clearly done before, with practiced speed and minimal wasted motion. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's genuinely revealing about priorities. Saga and archaeological evidence suggests raiders often specifically targeted iron tools and cooking equipment alongside more obviously valuable items like silver and jewelry, because good ironwork was genuinely expensive and useful back home. Considerably more practical than you might assume for a group popularly imagined as chasing purely glamorous plunder. Imagine crossing an ocean to violently raid a village and walking away with, among other things, someone's really excellent cooking pot. There's something almost comically domestic buried inside all this violence, though obviously nobody actually living through it at the time would have found much comedy in it. You catch sight of resistance forming now, small and desperate, a few local men, presumably farmers rather than trained warriors, armed with whatever tools were closest to hand, pitchforks, an axe clearly meant for splitting wood rather than splitting people, forming a rough, nervous line between the raiders and a group of women and children being hurried toward the tree line. It's a genuinely brave, hopeless gesture, and you feel a complicated knot of emotion watching it, because you know, with the grim clarity of hindsight, how badly outmatched these defenders almost certainly are. Historians still argue, and this argument matters more than it might initially seem, about how uniformly one-sided these encounters actually were. Popular imagination tends to picture Viking raiders as unstoppable, and while their combat experience and equipment absolutely gave them a real, significant advantage in most cases, the historical and archaeological record does include instances of raids going badly for the attackers, ambushes, unexpectedly organized local resistance, raiders killed or captured. This wasn't purely one-directional violence against helpless victims every single time, even though that pattern absolutely dominated the overall historical record and remains, for good reason, the dominant image people carry away from this whole era. The raid captain's group has reached the church now, and you follow at a slight distance, watching as they force the doors, not without some resistance, apparently, judging by the shouting from inside and the brief, tense standoff before the doors finally give way. This building represents the real prize here, the concentrated wealth of decades or centuries of religious donation and craftsmanship, and the raiders clearly know it, moving inside with focused urgency rather than the more relaxed efficiency you saw at the farmhouse. You linger near the entrance for a moment, and there's a genuine, uncomfortable heaviness to this specific location that the earlier looting somehow didn't carry quite as heavily, maybe because this building represents something more than material wealth to the people who built and used it, a spiritual center rather than purely a storage facility. Remember Lindisfarne, that first shocking raid you witnessed all the way back at the very beginning of this whole journey? This scene is playing out the exact same way it did there, and would continue playing out, with grim, repetitive regularity, across countless coastlines for the next 2.5 centuries. Outside, you hear the sound of horses now, not many, maybe 2 or 3, someone from the settlement or a neighboring farm having managed, against considerable odds, to get mounted and riding, presumably toward whatever local authority might be capable of organizing a real defense. The raid captain hears it too, judging by the sharp, urgent order that immediately follows, voice carrying clearly even through the church's stone walls. Time, which already felt tight, has just gotten considerably tighter, and you can feel the entire operation's rhythm shift again, urgency ratcheting up another full notch as everyone inside realizes, simultaneously, that the clock on this raid just started running considerably faster than anyone would prefer. Section 5. The strike begins inside the church now. The scene is genuinely difficult to fully process, a strange, jarring collision between violence and craftsmanship, raiders moving with fast, practiced hands through a space clearly built with enormous care and reverence, stripping it of value with the same efficient detachment you watched at the farmhouse minutes earlier, except now surrounded by considerably more elaborate, obviously precious objects. Candlesticks, a beautifully worked silver chalice, an illuminated manuscript with covers set in gold and semi-precious stones, the kind of object that represents literally years of dedicated, skilled labor by monks who almost certainly never imagined it ending up stuffed unceremoniously into a raider's carrying sack. Mainstream historical fact, and it's genuinely important for understanding why churches specifically became such consistent targets throughout this era. Monasteries and churches concentrated an enormous, disproportionate amount of a region's actual wealth relative to their size and defensive capability. Precious metal objects donated over generations by wealthy patrons seeking spiritual favor, combined with minimal or non-existent armed defense, made religious buildings genuinely irresistible targets, wealthy, soft, and largely undefended, sitting right there along vulnerable coastlines like an open invitation nobody back in Scandinavia felt any particular religious obligation to decline. A monk, considerably braver or considerably more foolish than seems entirely wise given the circumstances, has positioned himself directly between the raiders and what's clearly an especially significant object, a reliquary, probably, based on its ornate design, likely containing some genuinely important religious relic. There's a tense standoff, just a few seconds long, the monk's terror obvious but his resolve equally obvious, and you find yourself holding your breath, genuinely uncertain how this specific moment resolves. The raid captain, to his credit or perhaps simply out of pure pragmatic time pressure rather than any particular mercy, shoves the monk aside rather than doing anything considerably worse, grabs the reliquary himself, and keeps moving. Not every version of this scene, historically, ended quite this gently, and it's worth sitting with that discomfort honestly rather than pretending otherwise. Here's your quirky tidbit, genuinely surprising to a lot of people encountering it for the first time. Raiders didn't always simply melt down or directly sell precious religious objects wholesale. Archaeological finds occasionally include Christian religious items, crosses, reliquary fragments, reworked into Norse jewelry or decorative objects, sometimes with pagan symbols added directly alongside or worked into the original Christian design, suggesting raiders viewed captured religious objects less as inherently sacred and more as simply valuable, aesthetically pleasing raw material to be repurposed however seemed practical or attractive. Historians still argue about how much this reflects genuine religious indifference toward Christian symbolism specifically versus a broader, pragmatic Norse approach that treated most portable wealth, regardless of its original religious context, as fair game for repurposing. Outside, the sounds of the wider raid continue, shouting, the occasional crash of something heavy being knocked over, and underneath it all, a persistent current of crying and fear from villagers who've either failed to escape or chosen to stay near enough to watch what's happening to their homes and community, unable to look away even as the danger stays very real. You catch sight, through a narrow church window, of a small cluster of raiders herding several people together near the settlement's central area, not violence exactly, in this particular glimpse, but clearly coercion, clearly the beginning of something you already know, from earlier parts of this journey, is coming. We need to talk honestly about this next part, because a genuine, complete account of raiding can't responsibly skip past it. Capturing people for enslavement was a significant, deliberate component of many raids throughout this period, not an occasional unfortunate side effect but a core, calculated economic objective alongside portable material wealth. Remember those Rus trade networks stretching south toward Byzantium and the Islamic world, moving furs and honey alongside enslaved captives? This is where that grim supply chain frequently began, right here, in exactly this kind of chaotic, violent morning. Ordinary people's lives appended and moneized within the space of a single terrifying hour. You watch this unfold with real discomfort, and that discomfort feels appropriate, honestly, rather than something to smooth over or minimize for the sake of a cleaner, more comfortable narrative. This entire journey has tried to give you the full, complicated picture of the Viking Age, remarkable engineering, sophisticated trade, genuinely progressive legal rights for women, impressive craftsmanship. But none of that erases or excuses moments exactly like this one, real violence and real exploitation happening to real people who never asked to be part of anyone's historical narrative, dramatic or otherwise. Back inside the church, the raiders are finishing their work, sacks now heavy and awkward, several men already moving back toward the doors, urgency clearly building as that earlier sound of approaching horses lingers uncomfortably in everyone's mind. The captain pauses just briefly at the doorway, glancing back once at the stripped, disordered interior behind him, not with any visible remorse, more the quick, assessing look of someone mentally confirming the job's been done thoroughly before moving on to the next task. Then he's out the door, shouting orders, and the whole operation shifts again, gathering itself for whatever comes next as that morning sun climbs steadily, indifferently higher above a settlement that will genuinely never be quite the same again. Section 6. Chaos in the village. The settlement around you now looks fundamentally different from the peaceful scene you first glimpsed from the water just an hour or so ago. Doors hanging open or broken entirely, scattered belongings abandoned mid-flight, smoke rising from at least one structure that's caught fire, whether deliberately or simply through the chaos of the raid itself. You're standing near what was clearly the settlement's small central gathering area, and the raiders are converging here now, hauling their various sacks and bundles, calling out to each other in quick, efficient exchanges that sound less like triumphant celebration and more like genuinely busy people coordinating a complicated logistics problem. Mainstream historical fact worth pausing on here: raids of this scale typically didn't burn an entire settlement to the ground as standard practice, contrary to some dramatic popular depictions. Fire was sometimes used strategically, to create chaos, cover a retreat, or punish specific resistance, but wholesale destruction actually worked against a raiding party's core interests, since a completely devastated settlement couldn't be productively raided again in future years. There's a genuinely uncomfortable, almost businesslike logic buried in this, keeping a target viable for repeat visits, rather than a purely one-time act of maximum destruction, represented a kind of long-term strategic thinking that sits oddly alongside the immediate violence of any individual raid. You watch the sacks and bundles being roughly sorted and consolidated, precious metals separated from textiles, food stores grouped together, and that reliquary from the church handled with slightly more visible care than the rest, presumably reflecting its especially high individual value. There's an odd, almost mundane efficiency to this whole process that clashes sharply against the visible devastation surrounding it: houses standing open and ransacked, a few small fires still smoldering, the general disordered aftermath of violence layered awkwardly against men calmly organizing loot like particularly aggressive movers finishing up a job. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's a genuinely practical detail people rarely picture. Raiders reportedly sometimes carried simple balance scales even during raids themselves, allowing quick, rough valuation of silver and other precious metals on the spot, helping settle disputes over how loot should eventually be divided among crew members once everyone returned safely to the ship. Imagine mid-raid inventory management, someone pausing amid genuine chaos to quickly weigh a piece of silver jewelry, and there's something almost darkly comic about that level of organized bookkeeping happening in the middle of what is, by any reasonable measure, an actively unfolding crisis for everyone else involved. The captives you glimpsed earlier are being gathered more fully now, a small group, mostly younger adults and some older children, being moved together under guard toward the beach, and there's real, visible fear and grief in that group that no amount of narrative distance should let you look away from entirely. This is the human cost sitting directly alongside everything else you've witnessed today: the impressive seamanship, the efficient organization, the genuinely fascinating cultural details, and a complete, honest account has to hold both truths simultaneously rather than letting the more entertaining details quietly crowd out this considerably harder one. Local resistance, such as it was, has largely scattered or retreated by this point. That small group of farmers with their pitchforks and improvised weapons either fled or, in at least one visible case near the settlement's edge, didn't survive the encounter, a sobering reminder that this entire operation, whatever its more mundane logistical details, remained fundamentally an act of serious, sometimes lethal violence against people with genuinely minimal capacity to defend themselves. Historians still argue about casualty rates in raids of this scale and type, since surviving records rarely if ever provide reliable numbers, filtered as they typically are through either horrified victim accounts likely to emphasize maximum devastation, or largely absent raider perspectives that simply didn't bother recording this kind of routine operational detail for posterity. You notice the raid captain checking the sky now, gauging the sun's position with the same practiced, weathered squint you saw from the navigator back on the ship before dawn, and there's a shift in his posture, a visible calculation happening. How much time remains before this operation needs to wrap up and retreat safely back to the ship, balanced against whatever additional value might still be extracted from a settlement that's already substantially picked over. This is the genuine tactical heart of raiding as a practice, knowing precisely when enough is enough, when the risk of lingering starts to meaningfully outweigh whatever additional plunder remains available. Somewhere in the middle distance, that earlier sound of approaching horses has grown considerably louder, and you catch a fresh ripple of urgency moving through the raiding party, quick glances exchanged, weapons checked one more time. Whatever local defense force is being mustered in response to this morning's chaos is getting closer, and the captain's earlier calculation about timing has just become considerably more pressing. The settlement behind you is smoking, stripped, and largely emptied of both people and portable wealth, but the day's events, you're quickly realizing, are very much not finished yet. There's still the matter of actually getting everyone and everything safely back to that beached ship before whatever's coming down that road actually arrives. Section 7. The church doors. The captives are moving now, a small, frightened group being herded quickly toward the beach under close guard, and you fall in near the edge of this procession, watching the strange, uncomfortable mix of emotions playing across different faces, terror, obviously, but also a kind of stunned numbness in some. The particular blank expression of people whose entire understanding of their own lives has just been violently rewritten within the space of a single morning. This is, historically speaking, an enormously significant piece of the raiding economy, and it deserves honest, clear-eyed attention rather than quiet omission for the sake of a more comfortable narrative. Mainstream historical fact: enslavement of captives represented a genuinely major, deliberate economic driver behind much Viking Age raiding activity throughout this entire period, not merely an occasional grim side effect of otherwise material plunder. Captured people were transported, sold, and traded across enormous distances, some remaining within Scandinavian households as domestic labor, others moved through those established Rus River trade networks you traveled earlier on this broader journey, eventually reaching markets as far away as Byzantium and the Islamic Abbasid world, where demand for enslaved labor remained substantial and consistent throughout this period. You watch one of the guards, a younger man not much older than some of the captives themselves, handling this specific task with a kind of grim, businesslike detachment that's honestly more unsettling than open cruelty might be, not sadistic, exactly, just entirely, uncomfortably routine, the practiced efficiency of someone doing a job he's clearly done before and expects to do again. This detachment tells you something important about how normalized this specific practice had become within this particular economic and cultural system, however genuinely disturbing that normalization reads from your considerably more distant vantage point. Here's a quirky tidbit that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else here, worth including precisely because it complicates any overly simple narrative. Enslaved individuals within Norse society weren't uniformly treated identically across all contexts, and legal codes from later, better documented periods suggest some enslaved people could eventually earn freedom, be formally freed by an owner, or occupy relatively skilled household roles rather than uniformly brutal forced labor. This doesn't soften or excuse the fundamental violence of enslavement itself, but it does complicate any flattened, oversimplified picture, reminding you that historical systems of exploitation, however clearly wrong by any reasonable modern standard, rarely operated with perfect uniformity across every single individual case. Historians still argue, and this particular debate carries real weight, about the actual overall scale of Viking Age slave-taking relative to other contemporary medieval societies, several of which, including various Christian European kingdoms and the Islamic world, also maintained active slave trades and institutions of enslavement during this exact same period. This context doesn't excuse Norse participation in the practice, but it does push back against any narrative implying Norse raiders were uniquely or exceptionally cruel compared to broader medieval norms around human bondage, which were, across nearly the entire contemporary world, genuinely brutal by any modern measure. You notice, amid the group being moved toward the beach, a woman clutching a child close, and the guard nearby, after a brief, quiet exchange you can't fully follow, allows them to stay together rather than separating them immediately, a small, specific mercy within an otherwise devastating situation, and it's worth noting precisely because it complicates rather than simplifies the moral picture you're witnessing. History, as you've been reminded repeatedly across this entire journey, rarely offers clean, uncomplicated narratives, and this moment is no exception. The beach comes into view again now, and your ship sits exactly where you left it, hull still firmly grounded on the sand, crew members already working to load the accumulated plunder aboard with quick, practiced efficiency. There's a genuine logistical challenge here, worth appreciating on its own technical terms even amid everything else. Loading a longship properly requires careful weight distribution, heavier items positioned low and centered to maintain stability for the return crossing, and you watch experienced crew members directing this process with the same unhurried, confident competence you've seen displayed throughout this entire operation. The captives are being loaded too, moved toward a specific section of the ship, and this part of the scene is genuinely difficult to witness without a real, appropriate weight of discomfort settling over you. Remember that woman from the household back near the very start of this whole broader journey, the one managing her entire farm's fortunes with quiet, confident authority? Somewhere, on some equally ordinary morning just like this one, she or someone very much like her could just as easily have ended up in exactly this position instead, a sobering reminder that historical narrative, however fascinating in its broader sweep, is ultimately built from countless individual human experiences, many of them genuinely devastating rather than merely academically interesting. Behind you, back toward the settlement, that sound of approaching horses has grown louder still, close enough now that you can make out actual voices carried on the wind, shouted commands from what's clearly an organized, if hastily assembled, local defense force. The raid captain's earlier calculation about timing has officially run out of slack, and you can feel the entire crew's urgency spike sharply, that final phase of any successful raid now fully underway, not the violence and plunder you've spent the morning witnessing, but the equally critical, equally dangerous business of actually getting away cleanly before local defenders arrive in genuinely meaningful numbers. Section 8. Those taken captive. Everything is happening faster now, that earlier methodical efficiency replaced by something considerably more urgent, crew members hauling the last sacks of plunder aboard while others stand ready near the ship's sides, weapons drawn, watching the tree line and the road beyond it with obvious, sharpened tension. You climb aboard yourself, finding a spot near the stern, and from this slightly elevated vantage point you can see the full scope of what's happening, a genuinely coordinated, practiced retreat unfolding in real time, each crew member apparently understanding exactly their role in this final, critical phase without needing much explicit direction. Mainstream historical fact, and it's genuinely central to understanding why coastal raiding remained viable as a strategy for so many decades. The retreat phase represented arguably the single most dangerous moment in any raid, precisely because a raiding party, however successful up to this point, was inherently vulnerable while loading a ship and preparing to depart, weighed down with plunder and captives, potentially caught between an approaching land-based defense force and the water itself. Successful raiders needed genuine discipline and coordination specifically for this phase, not just for the initial assault, and crews that handled retreats poorly tended not to survive long enough to become the celebrated warriors saga literature likes to remember. You watch the last few crew members practically sprint the final stretch from settlement to beach, one clearly favoring an injured leg, supported roughly but effectively by a companion, and there's no time here for anything resembling gentle care, just fast, practical assistance getting everyone aboard as quickly as possible. The captives are secured somewhere amidships, guarded but no longer being actively herded, the immediate logistics of the raid itself essentially complete, replaced now by the equally demanding logistics of simply escaping successfully. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it connects nicely back to something from much earlier in this whole journey. Remember that detail about raiders sometimes timing landings around tidal patterns? This exact retreat phase is precisely where that planning pays its real dividend. An incoming tide, if the timing worked out correctly, would help refloat a beached ship with considerably less brute physical effort than trying to force a fully loaded vessel off dry sand purely through manpower. You can feel it now, actually, a subtle shift in the ship's stability beneath you, water lapping noticeably higher against the hull than when you first climbed aboard hours earlier. The local defenders are visible now, emerging from the tree line at the settlement's edge, a genuinely mixed group, a few mounted riders who look like they might actually have proper weapons and training, alongside considerably more farmers and villagers armed with whatever they'd managed to grab on short notice. It's a scene that could, in slightly different circumstances, have turned into a genuinely serious pitched battle, and you find yourself holding your breath again, watching to see exactly how this specific confrontation actually resolves. The raid captain, though, has clearly made his calculation, and it's not to stand and fight unnecessarily. With the ship now floating freely, crew fully aboard, and plunder secured, there's no strategic reason to risk additional casualties in a confrontation that offers no meaningful additional reward. Oars are already in the water, and the ship begins pulling away from shore with the same practiced, coordinated rhythm you first noticed all the way back before dawn, except now moving in the opposite direction, away from land rather than toward it. Historians still argue, incidentally, about how often raids actually ended in this relatively clean, uncontested withdrawal versus genuinely violent, costly confrontations with defenders. Surviving accounts, understandably, tend to emphasize the dramatic clashes rather than the comparatively unremarkable successful escapes, which creates a real bias in what actually survives in the historical record. A raid that ended quietly, with the ship simply pulling away before serious resistance arrived, would rarely generate the kind of dramatic account that gets remembered and retold for centuries, meaning the historical record probably overrepresents violent confrontations relative to how often raids actually concluded. You watch the defenders reach the beach just as the ship clears the shallows, several riders pulling up short at the water's edge, clearly recognizing the futility of any further pursuit against a vessel now moving freely under or power into open water. There's shouting, some of it clearly furious, some perhaps simply grief, carried faintly across the widening gap between ship and shore, and it's a genuinely sobering sound to sit with, a community's raw, immediate reaction to violence and loss that will take considerably longer than this single morning to properly process. The ship settles into a steady, sustainable rhythm now, oars working in that familiar, practiced unison, and gradually the settlement behind you shrinks smaller against the coastline, smoke still rising from that one burning structure, the whole scene slowly folding back into the general shape of coastline, rather than specific, devastated community as distance does its usual quiet work of abstraction. Somewhere ahead, open water waits, and beyond that, eventually, home. But there's still considerable daylight left in this particular day, and you settle in for what promises to be a long, watchful journey back toward safety. Section 9. Counting the plunder. The immediate danger has passed now, at least for the moment, and there's a genuine, palpable shift in the ship's atmosphere as the coastline recedes properly into the distance behind you, shoulders visibly relaxing. A few quiet, relieved exchanges between crew members, someone even managing something close to a genuine laugh, sharp and a little too loud. The particular sound of released tension rather than actual humor. You recognize this feeling, honestly, even across the considerable historical distance separating you from everyone around you, that specific, universal human relief of having survived something genuinely dangerous. Mainstream historical fact, worth sitting with during this comparatively calmer stretch. The return voyage from a successful raid typically involved genuine logistical complexity beyond simple navigation, particularly regarding the practical management of plunder, captives, and any wounded crew members across what could be a multi-day journey depending on distance from home. This wasn't purely a triumphant victory lap. It required continued careful seamanship, rationing of limited food and water stores, and ongoing vigilance against weather or, in some documented cases, retaliatory pursuit by other ships if word of the raid spread quickly enough along the coast. You notice crew members now beginning a more careful, organized accounting of the day's plunder, the kind of methodical sorting and rough valuation you glimpsed earlier happening in a considerably more relaxed, unhurried fashion now that immediate danger has passed. Silver items separated from textiles, that reliquary from the church handled with obvious continued care given its likely exceptional value, food stores checked and consolidated. There's an oddly satisfying, almost domestic rhythm to this process, entirely at odds with the violence that produced these goods in the first place, and that dissonance is worth sitting with rather than glossing past. Here's your quirky tidbit, genuinely fascinating from a practical standpoint. Shares of raiding plunder were typically divided according to established, mutually understood customs rather than simple, chaotic first-come first-served grabbing. The ship's owner or captain often received a somewhat larger portion reflecting the investment and risk involved in organizing the expedition, while ordinary crew members received more standardized shares, with some evidence suggesting particularly skilled or senior warriors might negotiate slightly enhanced portions based on individual reputation. Essentially, even something as chaotic seeming as raid plunder operated according to a surprisingly formalized compensation structure, closer to a commission-based business arrangement than a lawless free-for-all. The captives remain quiet, understandably, huddled together in their designated space aboard the ship, and you find your attention drawn back to them repeatedly throughout this calmer stretch, unable to fully settle into the relieved atmosphere spreading among the crew around you. One of the guards, that same younger man from earlier, brings them water at one point, a small, almost mundane gesture of basic care that sits uncomfortably alongside the fundamental violence of their situation, another reminder that historical reality rarely organizes itself into clean, simple moral categories. Historians still argue about the specific onward journey and eventual fate typically awaiting captives from raids of this particular scale and region, whether most ended up remaining within Scandinavian households as domestic or agricultural labor, or whether a larger proportion moved through those longer trade networks toward more distant markets. The honest answer probably depends enormously on specific regional and period variation, individual circumstances, and frankly, factors that simply didn't get recorded in ways that survive for modern historians to properly reconstruct, leaving considerable, genuine uncertainty in exactly this area. You notice the sun climbing higher now, well past that early morning position, casting the whole scene in a considerably brighter, harsher light than the soft, misleading beauty of dawn you witnessed hours earlier. There's something almost thematically appropriate about that shift, morning's deceptive gentleness giving way to the plainer, more honest light of full day, illuminating everything currently aboard this ship with equal, unflattering clarity. The plunder, the captives, the exhausted but genuinely relieved crew, all of it simply, unavoidably visible now in a way the earlier darkness had conveniently obscured. A brief, practical meal is shared among the crew at this point, that same modest dried fish and hard bread you noticed before dawn, supplemented now by whatever food stores were successfully claimed from the settlement itself, and there's something genuinely uncomfortable, worth acknowledging rather than skipping past, in watching raiders casually eating bread almost certainly baked by hands that, mere hours ago, belonged to someone now fleeing or grieving back on that devastated coastline. History rarely offers you the comfort of clean separation between violence and its immediate, mundane aftermath. The captain, meanwhile, has returned his attention to navigation, consulting quietly with that same weathered navigator from before dawn, plotting the specific route home based on wind, current, and whatever landmarks remain visible along this particular stretch of coastline. There's still considerable daylight ahead, and considerable distance still to cover, and beneath the crew's genuine relief at having survived the raid itself, you can sense a returning, practical focus settling back in. Today's danger may have passed, but today's journey is very much still underway, and the sea, as everyone aboard clearly understands from long experience, has never particularly cared how successful or unsuccessful anyone's morning happened to be. Section 10, Midday Reckoning. Midday settles over the ship now, sun sitting almost directly overhead, and there's a strange, suspended quality to this stretch of the journey, the dramatic tension of dawn and the raid itself now several hours behind you, while whatever challenges the afternoon and evening might hold remain still comfortably distant, unclear, and unhurried. This is, honestly, one of the less dramatic but genuinely important parts of any successful raiding expedition, the long, steady middle stretch where nothing especially eventful happens, but where careful, ongoing management keeps the whole operation actually functioning. Mainstream historical fact worth appreciating during this calmer stretch: sustained rowing across open water represented genuinely serious physical labor, and crews typically rotated positions at the oars in shifts to manage fatigue across longer voyages, rather than expecting the same individuals to row continuously for hours on end. You watch this rotation happening now, tired men gratefully relinquishing their oars to fresher crew members, stretching cramped shoulders and backs with the universal, recognizable relief of anyone who's just finished genuinely demanding physical work. A wounded crew member, the one you noticed being supported during the earlier retreat, is receiving more careful attention now that there's actually time for it, someone examining and cleaning what looks like a fairly serious cut along his leg, using materials that look distinctly improvised but clearly familiar to whoever's handling the treatment. Norse medical knowledge, while obviously lacking modern understanding of infection and germ theory, wasn't purely primitive guesswork. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests genuine practical skill in wound treatment, splinting, and herbal remedies, developed through considerable hard-won experience treating exactly this kind of injury. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's genuinely charming in an odd way. Honey was apparently used fairly commonly as a wound treatment throughout this period and region, and modern science has actually validated this practice to a meaningful degree, since honey does possess genuine antibacterial properties that would have provided real, if not fully understood, medical benefit. Somewhere on this ship, someone is very possibly treating a raid injury with what amounts to a reasonably sound, evidence-based medical intervention, entirely without any modern understanding of exactly why it actually works, which is honestly a pretty solid track record for medieval folk medicine. The captives, meanwhile, have settled into a kind of exhausted, watchful stillness, the acute terror of the morning's events gradually giving way to something quieter and more sustained, not resignation exactly, but the particular numbness that follows genuine trauma once the immediate crisis passes and a longer, uncertain ordeal clearly begins settling in instead. You find yourself returning to this part of the scene repeatedly throughout the voyage, unable to fully separate your attention from it even as the rest of the ship's activity continues around you with its own separate, more mundane rhythm. Historians still argue about the day-to-day treatment of captives during this kind of return voyage specifically, since surviving accounts rarely focus in detail on this particular, unglamorous logistical stretch of any raiding expedition. What evidence does exist suggests treatment probably varied considerably based on individual captors' temperament and the captive's perceived value or usefulness, rather than following any single, uniform standard practice. Another example of history resisting the kind of clean, simple generalization that would make this whole narrative considerably easier to summarize neatly. You notice the coastline has fully disappeared now, nothing visible in any direction except open water and sky, and there's a genuine, quiet vulnerability to this stretch of the voyage that the earlier drama of the raid itself somehow didn't carry quite as heavily. No land, no immediate threat, just the ship itself and the vast, genuinely indifferent ocean surrounding it, entirely dependent on the navigator's skill and a considerable amount of accumulated maritime experience to eventually find safe passage back toward familiar shores. The captain moves through the ship periodically, checking in with different crew members, examining the secured plunder, exchanging a few words with the navigator about their current position and heading, the ongoing, unglamorous work of actually running a ship successfully across open water, considerably less dramatic than the raid itself but genuinely just as essential to the expedition's overall success. Remember that boat builder from the very beginning of this whole journey, patiently fitting rivets into curved oak planking? This is precisely the kind of voyage his careful, unhurried craftsmanship was actually built to survive, flexing and holding steady across exactly this kind of long, demanding open water crossing. As the sun begins its slow, gradual descent from its highest midday point, you sense the ship's overall rhythm settling into something sustainable, almost meditative, oars working steadily, wind occasionally catching the sail enough to ease the rowing burden, the accumulated tension of the morning's events gradually, incompletely dissolving into the routine, practiced business of simply getting everyone safely home. There's still considerable distance ahead, and the afternoon holds its own uncertainties, but for this particular stretch of the day, The ship moves forward with the steady, unhurried confidence of a crew that has, whatever else remains true about this morning's events, successfully survived the most dangerous part of their expedition. Section 11. The defenders arrive. The afternoon sun is beginning its long, gradual slide toward the horizon now, and you notice a subtle shift in the crew's collective attention, heads turning periodically to scan the water behind the ship with the kind of practiced, unhurried vigilance that suggests this isn't purely idle habit. Successful raids, as you're about to learn firsthand, don't always end cleanly with a simple, uncontested departure from shore. Sometimes the consequences follow you out to sea. Mainstream historical fact, and it's genuinely relevant to understanding the full risk calculus of coastal raiding. Local defenders or allied coastal communities occasionally organized rapid naval pursuit in response to raids, particularly in regions where maritime defense had developed some organized capability following repeated earlier attacks. This wasn't universal. Many coastlines throughout this period lacked any meaningful naval response capacity, but it represented a genuine, real risk that experienced raid captains had to factor into their broader operational planning, not just for the raid itself but for the entire return journey. A shout goes up from the ship's stern, and you turn quickly to see what's caused it. A sail, visible now on the horizon behind you, considerably smaller and more distant than your own vessel but unmistakably present and, more concerning still, apparently on a course that suggests genuine pursuit rather than coincidental shared direction. The relaxed, steady rhythm from earlier in the afternoon dissolves almost instantly, replaced by that same sharp, focused urgency you recognized from the morning's retreat. The captain moves quickly to assess the situation, consulting briefly with the navigator, both men studying the distant sail with the kind of intense, practiced calculation that comes from genuine experience rather than panic. Historians still argue about how frequently pursuit situations like this actually resulted in genuine combat at sea versus simply outrunning or outmaneuvering pursuers through superior seamanship or more favorable wind conditions. Naval combat between vessels of this era and type was genuinely difficult and dangerous for both sides, and many pursuit situations likely resolved through evasion rather than direct confrontation, though the surviving evidence for this specific pattern remains frustratingly thin. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's a genuinely clever piece of practical seamanship. Raiders reportedly sometimes lightened their ship deliberately during pursuit situations, jettisoning lower-value plunder to improve speed and maneuverability when facing genuine risk of interception, essentially a medieval version of throwing excess cargo overboard to outrun a threat. Prioritizing survival and the most valuable goods over maximizing total profit from a single expedition. Imagine watching someone calmly toss a perfectly good cooking pot into the ocean because speed suddenly matters more than thoroughness. A genuinely pragmatic, if slightly painful, business decision made under real pressure. The crew responds to the captain's orders with the same practiced coordination you've witnessed throughout this entire day, oars working with renewed, focused intensity, the whole ship visibly picking up speed as everyone aboard channels considerable effort into this fresh, urgent task. You grip the ship's side, watching that distant sail carefully, trying to judge whether the gap between the two vessels is genuinely closing or holding steady, though honestly, at this distance, it's difficult to tell with any real confidence. The wind, fortunately, seems to be cooperating, catching your ship's sail with reasonable strength and providing meaningful additional speed beyond what the rowers alone could sustain. And gradually, over what feels like a genuinely tense stretch of time but is probably closer to 20 or 30 minutes in actual duration, the distant sail seems to be falling gradually further behind rather than closing the gap. Whether this reflects your own ship's genuine speed advantage, more favorable wind conditions specifically benefiting your vessel, or simply the pursuing ship's crew deciding the chase wasn't worth the risk and effort involved, remains genuinely unclear from your vantage point. You notice the captives during this tense stretch too, and there's something genuinely complicated in their expressions, a flicker of something that might be hope, watching a pursuing vessel that could, theoretically, represent rescue, mixed with the practical, grim awareness that even successful pursuit and interception would likely mean violent combat rather than any guaranteed safe resolution to their situation. Hope, in circumstances this genuinely desperate, rarely arrives uncomplicated. Eventually, gradually, that distant sail shrinks further and further until it's no longer clearly distinguishable from the general horizon, and a cautious, incomplete relief spreads through the crew once again, not quite the full release of tension you witnessed earlier after the initial retreat, but a meaningful easing nonetheless. The captain maintains a slightly faster pace than the earlier midday rhythm for a while longer regardless, unwilling to fully relax the crew's efforts until considerably more distance separates you from that potential threat, and you settle back into your place aboard the ship, watching the afternoon light continue its slow, steady shift toward evening, genuinely uncertain what other challenges this particular day might still have in store before it's finally, fully over. Section 12. Fighting retreat. The immediate threat of pursuit has faded now, distance and time gradually restoring something closer to the ship's earlier, steadier rhythm, and you notice the sun's position has shifted considerably, casting longer shadows across the deck and painting the water around you in progressively warmer, richer gold tones that feel, after everything this particular day has involved, almost deliberately, ironically beautiful. There's a strange, genuine peace to this specific stretch of late afternoon, even knowing everything that's happened to arrive at this exact moment. Mainstream historical fact worth sitting with here: successful return voyages from raiding expeditions represented, in a genuinely real sense, the actual measure of an expedition's overall success, arguably more significant than the raid itself. A raid that captured substantial plunder but resulted in the ship's loss, or the crew's capture or death during the return journey, would represent, by any practical measure, a genuine failure regardless of how much wealth had initially been seized. The entire enterprise, from before dawn preparation through the raid itself and this long return crossing, functioned as a single, continuous risk, and only actually reaching home safely completed it successfully. You watch crew members beginning to relax more genuinely now, some quiet conversations starting up, a few older warriors sharing what sounds like stories from previous, presumably similarly eventful expeditions, judging by the occasional bursts of laughter and the animated, exaggerated gestures accompanying certain particularly dramatic-sounding moments. There's something genuinely, recognizably human about this specific dynamic, people who've survived something dangerous together, gradually processing the experience through shared storytelling, already beginning the process of turning today's raw, immediate events into the kind of polished, retellable narrative that will eventually, years from now, become exactly the kind of saga material later Icelandic writers would work from. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it connects nicely backward across this whole journey. Some of these exact stories, told casually aboard ships just like this one during genuinely ordinary return voyages, likely formed the actual raw material eventually shaped into the more polished, dramatic saga narratives you encountered much earlier during your visit to Iceland, individual raiders' first-hand accounts, repeated and gradually embellished across dinners and firesides for years or even generations, slowly transforming lived, complicated experience into the cleaner, more heroic narrative structure that makes for genuinely compelling storytelling. Historians still argue, appropriately, about exactly how much distortion this process introduced compared to the messier, more morally complicated reality you've personally witnessed throughout this entire day. The wounded crew member from earlier is resting now, his leg properly bandaged, color returning gradually to his face as whatever combination of honey, cleaning, and basic rest has apparently begun doing its work. A few crew members check on him periodically, and there's a genuine, easy camaraderie in these interactions that sits, once again, in genuinely uncomfortable tension against everything you witnessed happening back at that settlement earlier this same day. The same men capable of real, coordinated violence also displaying real, evident care and loyalty toward each other. A complexity worth acknowledging rather than smoothing over into any simpler, more comfortable moral narrative. The captives remain quiet still, though you notice small, subtle shifts in their situation as the day continues, slightly more freedom of movement within their designated area, water and food shared periodically, small gestures that don't remotely erase the fundamental violence of their circumstances but do complicate any purely one-dimensional picture of pure, uninterrupted brutality. History, as you've been reminded so many times across this entire journey, rarely organizes itself into clean, simple categories, and this stretch of the voyage offers yet another quiet reminder of that persistent, sometimes uncomfortable truth. You notice the navigator has shifted his attention now, less focused on pursuit-related vigilance and more concentrated on the practical business of confirming the ship's actual position and heading, occasional glances at the sun's angle, quiet consultation with the captain about expected arrival time. Mainstream historical fact: return voyages sometimes took considerably longer than the outbound crossing, particularly if weather or navigational uncertainty required more cautious, conservative routing, meaning today's specific return journey might well extend well into evening or even require an overnight stop somewhere along a familiar, trusted stretch of coastline before finally reaching home port the following day. The light continues shifting around you, that earlier warm gold deepening now toward something richer and more orange, clouds along the horizon catching color in a way that feels, genuinely, like it deserves more appreciation than the exhausted, complicated crew currently aboard this ship probably has emotional bandwidth to properly offer it. You find yourself watching the horizon anyway, partly out of habit developed across this entire long day, partly because there's something genuinely calming about it after everything else you've witnessed, a reminder that the natural world continues its own steady, indifferent rhythms regardless of whatever chaos or violence or quiet relief happens to unfold on top of it. Section 13. Casting off evening is settling properly now, that earlier orange deepening steadily toward genuine sunset colors, and there's a specific quality to the light that feels, after this entire long, eventful day, almost unbearably beautiful in a way that sits strangely alongside everything you've witnessed since before dawn. The ship moves steadily westward, or perhaps a different direction entirely depending on your specific home port, chasing or fleeing the setting sun according to whatever direction actually leads back toward familiar waters. Mainstream historical fact worth appreciating during this quieter evening stretch: experienced crews typically knew their home waters intimately enough to navigate the final approach even in reduced light, relying on memorized coastal features, known depth patterns, and simple accumulated familiarity built across years of repeated voyages along the same general routes. This final stretch of any journey, however dramatic and dangerous the day's earlier events might have been, often settled into something considerably calmer and more routine, crew members drawing on deeply practiced knowledge rather than the more improvised, adaptive skills required during the actual raid itself. You notice the crew beginning small, practical preparations for eventual arrival, checking the Plunder's careful securing one final time, some quiet discussion about how the day's events and eventual profits might be reported and divided once safely home. A few crew members simply resting, genuinely exhausted after a day that began well before dawn and has, by this point, stretched across nearly the entire daylight cycle with barely a proper pause throughout. Here's your quirky tidbit, and it's a genuinely fitting one for this specific stretch of the journey. Norse sailors reportedly paid close attention to specific bird species and their behavior as informal but genuinely useful indicators of approaching land, certain seabirds rarely venturing far from coastal waters, their increasing presence serving as a reasonably reliable, low-tech early warning system that landfall was likely drawing near, well before actual coastline became visible to the naked eye. You notice, in fact, exactly this kind of shift happening now, gulls appearing in gradually increasing numbers, wheeling and calling around the ship in a way that feels, after this entire long day, genuinely reassuring. The captives, still gathered in their designated area, seem to sense this shift too, a new kind of tension settling over them distinct from the earlier acute terror of the raid itself. The dawning, concrete realization that whatever uncertain future awaits them is drawing genuinely, inescapably closer with each passing hour. There's nothing comfortable about watching this specific realization settle over them, and it's worth resisting any temptation to let the day's other, more adventurous elements crowd this particular truth out of your attention during these final hours of the voyage. Historians still argue, and it's worth raising one final time here, about how representative any single raid narrative like this one actually is of the broader, enormously varied pattern of Viking Age raiding across roughly 2.5 centuries and countless individual coastlines. Some raids were considerably larger and more organized, others smaller and more opportunistic. Some ended in genuine disaster for the raiders themselves, others, like this particular day's events, proceeded with relatively clean, uncontested success. Any single narrative, however carefully researched and considered, inevitably simplifies and represents just one possible version among countless genuine historical variations. You watch the sky continue its transformation, orange deepening toward genuine red and purple now, the sun itself beginning to actually touch the horizon, casting the whole ship and everyone aboard it in warm, dramatic silhouette. There's a specific, almost ceremonial quality to this moment that feels earned, somehow, after everything this particular crew has survived across this single, remarkably eventful day, not triumphant exactly, given everything genuinely difficult and uncomfortable you've witnessed alongside the more adventurous elements, but genuinely, meaningfully significant nonetheless. The captain stands near the steering oar, watching this same sunset with what looks like a kind of quiet, weathered satisfaction. The practical satisfaction of a difficult job completed successfully rather than any more elaborate emotional response. Remember that captain from the very beginning of this journey, back before dawn, scanning stars and reading currents with decades of accumulated experience? This exact moment represents the culmination of that entire skill set, patient expertise translated successfully into a genuinely dangerous expedition's safe, successful completion. Somewhere ahead, though not yet visible, home waters wait, familiar coastline, a harbor the crew knows intimately, families and communities who will greet this ship's safe return with genuine relief and celebration, entirely separate from and largely unaware of the specific human cost paid by an equally real community on the opposite side of this exact same story. Hours away and grieving losses that this returning crew celebration will never fully acknowledge or address. Both realities exist simultaneously, genuinely true at the same time, and that persistent, uncomfortable duality feels like an honest note to carry with you as this remarkable, difficult day finally, gradually approaches its close. Section 14. Sunset on the water. The sun sits low on the horizon now, genuinely touching the water's edge, and the entire sky has transformed into something almost overwhelming in its beauty, deep reds bleeding into purple, then finally that soft, settling blue that marks true evening's approach, the whole scene reflected and doubled across water, calm enough now to mirror it with startling, genuine clarity. You find yourself simply watching this transformation for a while, letting the day's accumulated weight settle rather than actively processing it further, because honestly, after everything you've witnessed since before dawn, some things genuinely need space and quiet rather than immediate analysis. Mainstream historical fact, offered gently here as the day winds toward its close. Successful raids like this one, repeated across countless similar expeditions throughout roughly 2.5 centuries, genuinely reshaped medieval Europe's political, economic, and cultural landscape in ways that extended vastly beyond any single day's specific violence and plunder. The wealth captured today, and on thousands of similar expeditions across this era, funded further ship construction, supported growing political ambitions back home, and gradually, cumulatively, helped transform Scandinavian society from the scattered farming communities you witnessed at this whole journey's very beginning into the increasingly centralized, wealthy kingdoms you encountered much later in your broader travels through this era. You notice the crew settling into a quieter, more contemplative mood now, the earlier relief and storytelling energy giving way to something calmer, more tired, genuinely reflective. A few men are simply watching the sunset alongside you, and there's a universal, recognizable quality to this specific moment. The particular exhausted peace that follows genuine danger successfully survived, regardless of which specific century or culture happens to be experiencing it. Here's your quirky tidbit, offered as this long day approaches its natural close. Some sagas and later folk traditions specifically describe raiders composing short verses or poems during return voyages, commemorating the day's specific events, honoring fallen or wounded companions, or simply marking a successful expedition's completion, an early, genuinely personal form of the exact kind of narrative shaping and storytelling you noticed developing earlier this same afternoon. Somewhere aboard a ship very much like this one, on some equally ordinary evening centuries ago, someone was very possibly quietly composing exactly this kind of commemorative verse, turning today's genuinely complicated, difficult events into something that could eventually be shared, remembered, and passed down. The captives remain quiet in the gathering dusk, and you find your attention drawn back to them one final time as this particular day genuinely nears its close. Their story, unlike the raiding crews, doesn't end with a satisfying return home and a well-earned rest. It's really just beginning, an entirely separate, considerably harder journey stretching ahead of them into a genuinely uncertain future. It feels important, honestly, to hold that truth clearly in mind even as the ship's overall mood settles into something closer to peaceful satisfaction, because a complete, honest account of this day can't responsibly let one group's relief fully overshadow another group's genuine, ongoing hardship. Historians still argue, in this final reflective stretch, about how ordinary raiders themselves actually understood and processed the moral complexity of what they'd done, whether raids like this one registered as morally significant violence requiring justification, or simply as an accepted, unremarkable feature of their broader economic and cultural world, requiring no more moral reflection than a farmer might apply to harvesting a field. The honest answer probably varies enormously by individual temperament and specific circumstance, and the sources available to modern historians simply don't provide reliable, consistent insight into this particular, genuinely important interior question. The last visible sliver of sun finally disappears below the horizon now, and the sky continues its slow transformation toward proper evening, stars beginning to emerge gradually overhead, the same kind of patient, careful navigation that guided this ship safely through pre-dawn darkness now preparing to guide it through evening darkness as well, full circle across a single, remarkably eventful day. The captain calls out something quiet to the crew, and oars settle into a slower, steadier evening rhythm, the ship continuing its patient progress toward home waters that remain, for now, still comfortably out of sight but genuinely, reliably close. You lean back against the ship's side, watching the first proper stars appear overhead, and there's a strange, quiet symmetry to this exact moment, echoing so closely that earlier pre-dawn scene from the very start of this entire day, darkness settling in, stars emerging, a crew moving steadily across water toward an uncertain but genuinely anticipated destination. The difference, of course, is everything that's happened in between, everything you've personally witnessed across Dawn's tension, the raid's violence and complexity, the long afternoon's careful, patient seamanship, and now, finally, this settling, genuinely earned evening calm as the ship carries its crew, its plunder, and its captives steadily onward through the gathering dark toward whatever waits at journey's end. Section 15. Nightfall. The stars are fully out now, spread thick and clear across a sky entirely free of the clouds that occasionally drifted through the pre-dawn hours you witnessed at this whole day's very beginning, and the ship moves through genuinely dark water with a quiet, steady confidence that feels, after everything you've witnessed since before dawn, like a hard-earned kind of peace. Somewhere ahead, though still not visible, home waters wait patiently, and you can sense, in the crew's settled, unhurried rhythm, a collective certainty that arrival is now simply a matter of remaining patient hours rather than any genuine uncertainty. You think back now, gently, across the full arc of this single, remarkably eventful day, that first cold, tense pre-dawn crossing, land emerging slowly from darkness at first light, the beach landings fast, coordinated urgency, the raid itself unfolding through the settlement with its genuinely complicated mixture of efficient plunder and real, serious violence, the captives whose presence has quietly, appropriately complicated any simpler narrative you might have otherwise constructed, the tense afternoon pursuit and its eventual, gradual resolution, and now finally, this settling, genuinely peaceful evening return beneath a sky full of stars that have, presumably, witnessed this exact same pattern repeated countless times across roughly 2.5 centuries of Viking Age raiding along countless similar coastlines. Mainstream historical fact, offered gently as this whole journey approaches its own quiet close, no single day's raid, however dramatic or eventful, ever fully captures the enormous variety and complexity of Viking Age raiding across its full historical scope. Some raids ended in genuine disaster, others in barely eventful, minor success. Some involved considerably more violence, others considerably less. And the specific mixture of skilled seamanship, genuine danger, real human cost, and practical, almost mundane logistics you've personally witnessed today represents just one possible thread among countless genuine historical variations, gathered and woven together here to help you understand something true about this era's underlying texture, even while remaining honestly, appropriately incomplete as any single day's account inevitably must be. You notice the crew's quiet conversation continuing softly around you, low voices exchanging final observations about the day, gentle laughter occasionally rising and settling again, and there's something genuinely, universally human about this closing rhythm, regardless of everything morally complicated about how this particular day actually unfolded. People who have survived something significant together, quietly processing it, quietly grateful simply to be moving steadily toward home and rest. And it feels important, honestly, to let that genuine, complicated humanity sit alongside everything else you've witnessed today rather than resolving it into any simpler, cleaner conclusion. Historians still argue, one final time tonight, about how best to hold and represent this specific tension, honoring the genuine skill, courage, and complicated humanity of individuals like this raiding crew, while never losing sight of the real, serious harm inflicted on people like those you watched fleeing, grieving, and ultimately captured back at that settlement earlier this same day. There's no fully satisfying resolution to this particular tension, and perhaps that's genuinely appropriate, since history, as you've been reminded so many times across this entire journey, rarely offers the kind of clean, comfortable resolution that would make it easier to simply file away and stop thinking about. The ship continues its steady, patient progress through the darkness, oars dipping in that same practiced rhythm you first noticed all the way back before this remarkable day even properly began, and gradually, you notice lights appearing far ahead on the horizon, small, scattered points of warm firelight marking a settlement, presumably home, waiting patiently through the darkness for this ship's safe, eventual return. There's a quiet murmur moving through the crew now, recognition and genuine relief, tired shoulders straightening slightly at the sight of familiar shores drawing steadily closer. Let the ship carry you now, gently, through these final dark waters toward those distant, welcoming lights, the day's full weight finally settling into something you can simply hold rather than actively process any further tonight. You've watched an entire day unfold, dawn until sunset and now into the deeper dark beyond it, violence and skill and genuine human complexity woven together in a pattern that repeated, with countless individual variations, across so many similar days throughout this remarkable, difficult era. The oars grow slower now, quieter, the crew's voices softening further as exhaustion finally, fully settles in after such a long, demanding day. The stars overhead continue their own slow, patient will across the sky, indifferent and constant, the same stars that watched this pattern repeat itself so many times across so many years, and will continue watching long after this particular ship, this particular crew, and this particular day have all faded quietly into the same soft, settled past that holds the entire remarkable, complicated story you've spent this whole journey exploring. Let your own eyes close now too, gently, drifting along on these same quiet, settling waters. There's nothing more to hold on to tonight, no further danger, no further urgency, just the soft, steady rhythm of oars slowing toward rest, and the patient, welcoming lights of home drawing closer through the dark. Rest now. The ship will find its harbor. The stars will keep their watch. And you can simply let this long, remarkable day finally, gently end.